You cannot compel a woman to marry. I do not compel. Mr. Elias Drummond set his leather satchel on the entrance hall table with the careful precision of a man accustomed to delivering facts others found inconvenient. The polished wood of the table gleamed faintly in the dim light. I present the arithmetic. The debt your father accrued against the Veldmoor estate stands at £437, Miss Wren. The estate may call it in at any moment. You would lose the shop, the cutting tools, the lease on your rooms in Norwich. Everything he spent 20 years building would unravel before your eyes. Perdita Wren stood in the entrance hall of Veldmoor Hall, her travelling case still clutched in one hand, and said nothing for a long moment. Her gaze swept past the solicitor, drawn instead to the house itself, a structure that seemed to demand attention. The ceilings rose to a height that appeared designed to gather shadow rather than dispel it, creating pockets of gloom even in the broad daylight filtering through the high windows. The wallpaper, a deep, faded green patterned with trailing ivy, had bleached unevenly over time, leaving pale ghost leaves where the vibrancy of colour had once held firm. A chandelier, heavy with age, hung above her. Only half its candles were lit, and their amber glow barely extended beyond their own glass, leaving the far corners of the hall in full, encroaching dark. She noted the wide corridor leading to her left, disappearing into the mansion's depths. The single closed door at the back of the hall, stout and unyielding. The grand staircase, its banister a dark, polished wood, rising ahead of her into the upper reaches of the house. And then, she noted the man at the top of it. She had not heard him descend. He was simply present, a silent, statuesque figure. One hand rested lightly on the newel post, his weight distributed with the profound stillness of someone who had been standing in that exact position for some time, observing. His shirt, a fine linen, was fastened to the collar, but the cuffs were loose at his wrists, hinting at a quiet disregard for minor formalities. An old scar, a thin silver line against the skin, traced a path across the back of his left hand, catching the faint chandelier light as he began his descent. His hair was the color of ink, dried to something darker than it ought to be, absorbing rather than reflecting the light. His eyes, when they finally reached her level, were the color of a January sky before snow, not cold exactly, but containing the promise of weather, of things yet unrevealed. They were the kind of eyes that had learned to give nothing away, a habit practiced until it became the very expression of his face. Miss Wren. His voice was even, devoid of any discernible inflection. Lord Veldmoor. Her own voice, though soft, carried a clear note of composure. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped at a distance that managed to be both formal and precisely calculated, close enough to speak without raising his voice, yet far enough that nothing about his posture could be mistaken for an approach, for intimacy. Drummond has explained the arrangement, he said, his gaze steady upon her. He has explained his version of it. I would hear yours. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement, but an acknowledgement of something he had not expected, a flicker of surprise in those storm-grey eyes. The estate holds your father's debt. I have no interest in collecting it from you directly, nor in seeing your livelihood destroyed. Marriage resolves the legal entanglement and places you as Countess of Veldmoor with all the security that title provides. If at the end of 1 year you find the arrangement incompatible, the debt is discharged regardless and you may leave. No further obligation on either side. You would walk away free, with your future secured. And what do you receive from it? She asked, her voice calm. He held her gaze, unwavering. A countess. She waited, her breath held, for him to elaborate, to offer a more complete explanation. He did not provide it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. That is not a complete answer, she said, her tone level. No, he agreed, his voice as flat as before. It is not. Drummond shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a small, nervous movement. The Count did not look at him, his attention remaining solely on Perdita. Let me show you the hall, Crispin Veldmoor said, a subtle invitation in his voice that transcended its usual measured tone. Before you decide. It was not phrased as an invitation in the conventional sense. It was not phrased as a command. It occupied a precise space between the two, a deliberate choice that Perdita recognized and found she respected. It meant he intended to show her the truth of the house, rather than merely arranging for her a tolerable impression of it. He offered no illusions, only stark reality. She tightened her grip on her traveling case. The solicitor, ever eager to be of service, reached for it, but she did not relinquish her hold. "Then show me," she said, her voice firm, accepting the challenge. He showed her the grand dining room, its long table set for a phantom feast, the drawing room with its faded tapestries and cold hearth, the expansive library on the east side of the ground floor, lined with countless volumes, their leather bindings aged and cracked. He led her through the kitchen passage, a bustling hub of unseen activity, and the servants' hall, where the echoes of generations of service still seemed to linger. They ascended to the first floor, where a long gallery stretched, lined with portraits of the Veldmoor line reaching back 2 centuries. He named almost none of them, offering only the occasional clipped detail when pressed. He answered the questions she asked with the same measured evenness he had used in the entrance hall, his gaze rarely meeting hers directly. He walked slightly ahead of her rather than beside her, a deliberate act of maintaining a distance he clearly considered necessary. His presence was a barrier, not an escort. The north wing was at the very end of the gallery corridor. She saw it, felt its presence, even before he spoke of it, a distinct section of the passage where the flooring changed abruptly from the warm oak boards. She had walked all the way from the entrance hall to cold, unpolished stone flags, worn smooth by time. 3 doors were visible in the deepening dimness, all closed, silent, and forbidding, and then a 4th door at the far end, set deeper into the wall than the others, heavier and more formidable, secured not with 1, but 3 separate locks across its face. Each lock was a testament to deliberate exclusion. He stopped walking. She stopped a pace behind him, her eyes fixed on the final door. "The north wing," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It has been closed since 1827. Nothing in it is in use." She looked at the 3 locks. Iron, all of them. The topmost gleamed with a newer, duller sheen, within the last decade, she would guess. The lower 2 were older, their metal darkened to a deep, rust-like color that matched the ancient stone around them, as if they had grown from the very fabric of the wall. "What is in it?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the keen curiosity that stirred within her. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the locked door. "Old things," he said, and his voice had changed, not by much, but she heard it. A slight tightening, a subtle shift in pitch, as though the words required more care, more restraint than the ones that had come before. A tremor of something beneath his controlled exterior. She waited, patiently, for him to continue. "It is the one condition of the arrangement, Miss Wren. You may have access to every other part of this house. The north wing is not to be entered. It is inviolable." She looked at the door a moment longer, its locked face a challenge. Then she looked at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. He was watching her with those winter sky eyes, waiting to see what she would say, what she would reveal. She recognized that her next words would tell him something profound about what kind of woman she was, and she found, unexpectedly, that she wanted him to have an accurate impression, an unvarnished truth. "I do not make agreements I have not examined thoroughly," she said, her voice clear, "but I do keep the ones I make, once given." Something shifted in his expression, small, brief, a faint tightening around his eyes, a subtle softening of his jaw. But it was there, a fleeting acknowledgement. "Then we have the basis of an arrangement," he said, a note of finality in his tone. Price, the butler, had served at Veldmoor Hall for 31 years, and had reduced his speech to the essential minimum sometime in the 2nd decade of his service. He moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, a shadow in the grand corridors. He led Perdita to her rooms, a suite on the 2nd floor, east-facing, bathed in the soft morning light. It comprised a comfortable sitting room, a spacious bedchamber, and a small dressing room that had been thoughtfully converted into a workroom by someone with a keen eye for practicality. A 2nd window had been installed, flooding the space with ample light. Price paused at the threshold, his posture stiff, and offered 3 words: "Dinner at 7." With that he departed, leaving Perdita to the quiet solitude of her new quarters. She unpacked her travelling case herself, methodically arranging her few belongings. The workroom was the most unexpected discovery. A long, sturdy table occupied the center, its surface smooth and inviting. A good lamp, already filled with oil, stood ready for use, promising illumination for long hours of detailed work. 2 shelves stood empty, waiting to be filled, while a third held a neat stack of linen, pressed flat as paper, its crisp edges a testament to careful preparation. Perdita stood in the doorway of the small room for a long time, a quiet sense of wonder settling over her. Someone had been told she was a seamstress. Someone had prepared this space specifically for her, anticipating her needs with a precision that bordered on prescience. The thought sat with her through the afternoon as she arranged her tools, the good shears, their blades gleaming, the meticulously organized needle case, the packet of pins, each one a tiny, sharp sentinel. It stayed with her through the dinner she ate alone, a solitary meal in the vast dining room, because the Count did not appear at 7 or at 7:15, and no one offered an explanation for his absence. The dinner itself was adequate, nourishing without being remarkable. The silence was complete, an oppressive blanket that swallowed all sound. Mrs. Nuttall, the housekeeper, a small woman with the posture of someone permanently braced against an unseen wind, brought the second course herself. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, her back to Perdita. "You'll want to keep your window latched," Mrs. Nuttall said, her voice low and even, without turning around. "The east side gets drafts this time of year. A chill can creep in unnoticed." Perdita looked at the window. The glass was still, reflecting the fading light of the autumn evening. The world outside was entirely without wind, the trees motionless against the twilight sky. "Thank you," she said, a flicker of something unreadable in her storm-grey eyes. Mrs. Nuttall left, her footsteps soft and quick. Perdita did not sleep easily that night. This was not unusual in unfamiliar places. She had trained herself, over years of early mornings and contracted work in other people's houses, to sleep with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that exhaustion was a professional liability. But Veldmoor Hall resisted easy rest. The house had sounds she had not catalogued yet, a symphony of creaks and groans that spoke of its vast age. The settling of old stone, the particular mournful note of wind, finding unseen gaps in the north-facing eaves, a low whistle in the dark. And then, sometime after 2 in the morning, something else, a sound distinct from the house's usual nocturnal symphony. She lay still, her senses acutely alert, and listened. It was faint, so faint that she told herself for a full 30 seconds that she was merely hearing her own pulse thrumming in her ears, or the subtle imagined movement of the night air. But a pulse did not have pattern, and what she was hearing had a distinct, undeniable pattern, a soft rhythmic tapping, each interval precisely the same as the last. Each tapping was followed by a barely audible drag, a whisper of friction, and then another tap, measured, precise, unyielding. The sound of a needle drawing thread through heavy fabric. She sat up, her heart a quiet drum against her ribs. The sound was unmistakably coming from the direction of the north corridor, the forbidden wing. She was certain of this, not because she could track it through the thick stone walls, but because the silence between each tap seemed to lean in that direction, as though the very air of the house were orienting itself toward that singular, persistent rhythm. She put her feet on the cold floorboards. A shiver traced its way up her spine, unrelated to the chill. She wrapped her dressing gown around her, its soft wool a meager comfort, and took the candle from the bedside table. With a slow, deliberate movement, she went to the door of her room. She opened it onto the corridor, revealing a stretch of oppressive darkness. The sound stopped, abruptly, completely. The corridor was empty and dark, a cavern of shadow. Her candle cast a narrow column of amber light, illuminating only the immediate vicinity, leaving the vastness beyond in an inky blackness. She stood in the doorway, the cold air reaching her ankles, until the flame in her hand had burned down perceptibly, a small solitary beacon in the silent house. Then, with a sigh that was barely audible, She went back inside and did not sleep again before morning. The rhythmic tapping, though silenced, echoed in her mind. In the days that followed, Perdita found her bearings in Veldmoor Hall by the same methodical approach she applied to any new commission. She moved through it slowly, observing and paying meticulous attention to what it was trying to tell her. A house, like a length of fabric, had its own language, its own texture. Veldmoor Hall was trying to tell her something. She was not yet sure what, but the whispers of its stone and the patterns of its shadows held a narrative. The servants avoided the north corridor by a habit so ingrained they probably no longer registered it as avoidance. It was simply an understood boundary, an unspoken rule. Meals appeared at the correct hours, punctual as clockwork. Fires were lit each morning, crackling cheerfully in the grates, pushing back the lingering chill of the night. The household ran with the quiet competence of long practice, a well-oiled machine, and no one mentioned the Count's irregular hours, his meals taken alone in his study, the way he appeared in the library at times that suggested he had not slept and had decided that pretending otherwise was more effort than it was worth. He carried the weariness of a man who had wrestled with private demons through the night. She found him there on the fourth morning, standing at the tall window that faced the back garden, a book open in his hand at a page he was clearly not reading. His gaze was distant, fixed on something beyond the glass. "Lord Veldmoor," she said, her voice a soft ripple in the quiet room. He turned, a fluid, unhurried movement. She had the sense that he had heard her on the stairs, perhaps even before, and had arranged himself before she arrived, not in the way of someone preparing a performance, but in the way of someone accustomed to composing himself before any social encounter, as though his default state was something he kept fiercely private, shielded from the world. "Miss Wren, good morning." His storm-grey eyes, though meeting hers, held a guarded distance. "I have a question about the household accounts." A pause, almost imperceptible. "Drummond manages those." "Not those accounts. I mean the historical records, the estate ledgers from the first half of the century." She watched his face, carefully noting the subtle shift in his expression. "I would like to know more about Veldmoor Hall, its past, its workings." He said nothing for a moment, his gaze assessing. Then, "The ledgers are in the lower shelf of the East Cabinet. The archivist's notes from 1845 onward are in the blue folder on the second shelf. I would prefer you not remove them from the library." His tone carried the weight of an unspoken command. "I had no intention of removing them," she said, her voice steady. He looked at her as though calculating the distance between what she had said and what she might truly mean by it, searching for hidden layers. She held the look, allowing him to calculate, to measure. "There is also a household diary from 1820 to 1830, he said finally, a subtle undercurrent of something unreadable in his tone. "Third shelf, brown cover. It may answer questions I cannot. Questions about the house, perhaps." She did not ask him to explain that cryptic remark. She simply took note of it, filing it away for later. She sat in the library for 3 hours that morning, not yet touching the brown-covered diary. Instead, she worked through the estate ledgers, letting the texture of the house form in her mind the way a length of cloth forms in the hands before you begin to cut. By feel, by weight, by the subtle direction in which it wants to lie, by the stories it holds within its threads. Twice during those 3 hours she heard it. Not the nighttime sound. This was different. Not the rhythmic tapping of needle and thread, but a single, distinct note, like a length of heavy silk being drawn quickly across a smooth table. A whisper of movement, sharp and fleeting, there and gone. Both times from the direction of the north corridor. Both times it was followed by a silence so complete, so absolute, that she could not have invented it. It was the sound of something that had ceased to move, leaving an echo in its wake. She did not mention it to the Count. He came to the library at noon, his footsteps quiet. He looked at the ledgers spread on the table, their pages open to her careful scrutiny, and said nothing. He poured 2 cups of tea from the tray Price had left, the steaming liquid fragrant in the quiet room, and set one beside her without asking if she wanted it. He took the other to the opposite side of the table, where he stood and read his own correspondence, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was the most companionable hour she had spent in the house so far, a quiet communion of shared space, and neither of them said a word through most of it. The silence was not empty, but rich with unspoken understanding. Near the end of it, she asked, "The fourth Count, who was he?" Crispin looked up from his papers, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers across the table. "My great-great-uncle," he said, his voice measured. "Aldrich Veldmoor. He held the title from 1821 until his death in 1849. He married in 1827. A silence, different from the previous ones, tighter. "Yes." Her name was Marin Croft before the marriage. His voice had changed in the way it had on the first evening in the North Corridor, careful, guarded. She died in November of 1827, 3 months after the wedding, a tragically short union. Perdita looked down at the ledger in front of her, where she had already found the entry she had been looking for, her finger tracing the faded ink. November the 3rd, 1827. One stark line. Countess deceased. All work in North Quarters suspended. The abruptness of the entry spoke volumes. She turned the page. Beneath a column of mundane household expenses for December of that year, she found it, a small telling detail, 3 locks to be fitted on the wing door, per the Count's instruction. No further mention of the north rooms in any subsequent ledger. The silence of the records was deafening. "What did she die of?" Perdita asked, her gaze lifting to his. Crispin folded his correspondence with a deliberate movement and set it aside. "Fever," he said, his voice flat. "So the record states." She heard the weight in those 4 words, the unspoken doubt. "You do not believe the record." He was looking at the window again, his storm-grey eyes distant, fixed on the winter sky beyond. "I believe the record is incomplete," he said. "There is a difference, a significant one." She waited, a quiet invitation for him to elaborate. He did not say more. She did not push, sensing a boundary. But she went back to the library that afternoon, while the light still held a pale, watery glow. She found the brown-covered diary on the 3rd shelf, exactly where he had said it would be. She set it on the table, its leather cover worn smooth with age, and opened it to November 1827. And there, she read what the household steward of that year had written in a careful, agitated hand about the last 3 days of the Countess Marin's life. The words on the page seemed to shimmer with a desperate, untold story. Mrs. Nuttall found her in the corridor at 10 o'clock that evening. The housekeeper was carrying a lamp, its soft glow preceding her, which meant she had been looking for Perdita. Her presence at this hour, in this part of the house, was unusual. "Miss Wren," the housekeeper said, her voice a low murmur, "the Count has asked that dinner be served at 7 going forward if you are willing. He believes it would be more convenient." "I am willing," Perdita said, her voice even. She sensed there was more to this encounter than a simple scheduling change. Mrs. Nuttall lingered, her small frame rigid. This was not typical of the woman whose general approach to a room was to complete her business and remove herself from it with the efficiency of someone who understood that her continued presence required specific justification. Now she seemed to be searching for words. "You have been in the library," Mrs. Nuttall said, stating it as a fact, not a question. "Yes." "The old records?" "Yes." The housekeeper set her lamp down on the hall table, the brass clinking softly against the wood. She smoothed a wrinkle from her apron that was not there, a nervous gesture. "The north wing," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, and then stopped, as if the words themselves were difficult to utter. Perdita waited, her gaze steady on the older woman. "It has been in that state since before I came to the hall," Mrs. Nuttall said finally, her voice imbued with a quiet solemnity. "I have been here 19 years, and in 19 years no one has unlocked that door. The previous housekeeper, Mrs. Galt, God rest her soul, told me once that she was there the night the 4th Count had the locks fitted. She said he did it himself, not a locksmith, himself, that he would not leave the task to anyone else, as if it were a sacred duty. He worked through the night," she said, his face grim. Mrs. Nuttall picked up the lamp, its light casting dancing shadows on her face. I am telling you this so that you understand it was not an idle instruction. It was a deliberate, desperate act. I understand that, Perdita said, her voice calm, though a chill, unrelated to the evening air, settled deep in her bones. Then I hope you'll forgive me for saying what I'm going to say. Mrs. Nuttall met Perdita's gaze directly for the first time since she had arrived at the hall, her storm-grey eyes holding a deep, weary concern. Every woman who has come to this house as Countess, or as the intended of the Count, has come to grief, Miss Wren. The 4th Count's wife died 3 months into the marriage. The 5th Count's wife lost her reason before the first winter was out and was taken to her family's care, where she remained for 40 years, a shadow of her former self. The current Lord Veldmoor's mother died when he was 7, a sudden, inexplicable illness. His father attempted a second marriage. The woman fled in February of the year she arrived without even stopping to pack her belongings, and she has never spoken publicly of what she saw here, only whispers of a profound terror. That is the record of this house as I know it. A pause, heavy with unspoken warnings. I am not a superstitious woman, Miss Wren. I am telling you the pattern, the undeniable, tragic pattern. Perdita looked at her steadily, absorbing every word, every nuance of fear and resignation. Thank you, Mrs. Nuttall. I appreciate your candor. It changes nothing, I expect, the housekeeper said, a note of weary fatalism in her voice. It changes my understanding of the situation. That is not nothing, it is everything. Mrs. Nuttall took up her lamp and went, leaving Perdita alone in the corridor, the silence once again settling around her, thicker and more profound than before. Perdita stood in the corridor for a long time after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded into the distant reaches of the house, after the hall had settled into its own deep, ancient dark. She was thinking about what she had read in the steward's diary that afternoon. Not the dry, brief accounting of the 4th Countess's death, but the lines that had come 3 pages earlier, dated 2 weeks before Marin Veldmoor died. The Countess has been taken poorly with the fever since Saturday last. She will not rest as the physician orders. She spends her hours in the north workroom at the sewing she brought from her father's house. When I asked her what she was making, she showed me a gown of ivory silk not yet halfway done. She said she had promised herself she would finish it. She said she would not die with the work undone. I did not take the meaning of this at the time. 3 pages later, in the same hand but more unsteady, as if the steward's own hand trembled with distress. The Countess died at 3:30 this morning. Her last words were heard by her maid. I write them here as the maid reported them. She said, "The work is not done." She said it twice, a desperate plea. The sewing has been left as it was, untouched. And then, a week after that, a chilling postscript. The Count has sealed the north rooms. He will not permit anything in them to be disturbed. I do not know what he intends to preserve. I think he does not know either. He seemed lost in his own grief and confusion. Perdita thought about a woman who had been a seamstress before her marriage, a woman whose hands understood the quiet dignity of creation, a woman who had understood that the worth of a thing lay not just in its existence, but in whether the work was finished, brought to its intended completion. She thought about a gown of ivory silk, half assembled, left on a mannequin in a room that had been locked for 40 years, while the thread held its position, suspended in time, and the hall learned the shape of its own profound absence. The image was vivid, almost tangible. She had been hired as a seamstress. She had been brought here to be a countess. She had not, until this moment, considered that these two things might be the same instruction, a singular interwoven purpose. She did not sleep that night either. The revelations of the day, the weight of the house's history pressed upon her. She lay in the dark, her senses acutely aware, and listened. The sound came at 2:20, the rhythmic tapping, faint and even, the same measured rhythm she had heard every night since she arrived. Needle, thread, the particular soft drag of heavy silk drawn through the eye, a ghostly echo of a task unfinished. She dressed quickly, silently, her movements precise in the moonlit room. She did not take the lamp. She took instead one of the short candles from the dresser and the box of matches beside it, their tiny forms a promise of light. She walked out of her room into the corridor, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, and turned north toward the source of the sound, toward the forbidden wing. She had not gone far. At the top of the gallery stairs, where the light from her candle barely reached, she met the Count. He was standing in the corridor in the full dark, a silent sentinel, not holding a light of any kind. She realized from the way he stood, utterly still, that he had been there for some time, that he had heard the sound too, a familiar companion in his lonely vigil. This was perhaps something he did regularly, standing outside his own locked wing in the middle of the night, listening to the persistent, mournful thing inside it. They looked at each other in the fragile light of her single candle, two figures caught in a shared moment of revelation. "You hear it," she said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. He did not deny it. His storm-grey eyes, though shadowed, held a raw honesty. "Every night," she pressed gently. "It began the night you arrived," he said, and his voice was low, stripped of its formal evenness, devoid of its usual careful control. It was the voice of a man speaking the truth, because the hour and the circumstances had made pretense more effort than it was worth, a voice worn smooth by long years of internal struggle. Before you came it was once a month, perhaps less, a sporadic, distant echo. Now it is constant. She watched his face in the candlelight, noting the subtle lines of strain etched around his mouth. "What is in the wing, Crispin?" It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it. It had simply emerged, unbidden, a natural consequence of the raw intimacy of the moment. He did not appear to notice, or rather he appeared to notice and to choose not to address it, because what she had asked was the more important thing, a question that demanded his full attention. "A room," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A workroom, and something that has been left unfinished for 40 years, a task suspended in time." "A gown," she said, her voice soft but certain. He went very still, his breath catching. "I read the steward's diary," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I know what Maren was doing in the days before she died. I know what her last words were. The work is not done." She held the candle steady. The flame did not waver, a small, unwavering beacon. The rhythmic sound from behind the locked door continued its measured, tireless rhythm, entirely undisturbed by their conversation, as though it had no interest in them at all, but would continue with or without their attention, a perpetual motion. "I think you know what it means. I think you have known for a long time deep in your heart." He turned his face toward the locked door, his profile stark in the candlelight. The silver scar on the back of his hand caught the light, a silent testament to a past attempt. "I have spent the better part of my life," he said, his voice laced with a profound weariness, "trying to find a way to resolve it without putting another woman in reach of it, to protect those who came after." "And you brought me here anyway," she finished, her tone devoid of accusation, simply stating a fact. "Yes." A pause heavy with unspoken conflict. "I did not expect you to be who you are. I had prepared for someone else entirely." She considered this for a moment. "You expected someone who would not notice, someone easily dismissed." He met her eyes, a flicker of something akin to self-reproach in their depths. "I expected someone who would keep her distance and let the year pass and take the settlement and leave, unburdened. I did not expect someone who would read the household records in the first week and stand outside my locked wing at 2 a.m. listening. Then we are both working with incomplete information," she said, her voice firm, "and I would rather we fix that. The truth is rarely simple, but it is always necessary." He looked at her for a long time, his storm-grey eyes searching hers. The sound continued, patient, certain of itself, a quiet insistence in the dark. "Sit with me," he said finally, his voice a low, unexpected invitation. "I will tell you what I know. All of it." He told her in the library by the fire, its flames casting dancing patterns of light and shadow on the walls. The lamps were turned low, their glow soft and intimate, and the night had settled fully outside the tall windows, a velvet curtain against the world. He spoke without the formal care he generally maintained, his words flowing more freely, not because he had decided to confide in her in a traditional sense, she thought, but because the relentless rhythmic sound from the north wing had, over the past few nights, stripped away the energy required for careful management, for maintaining his carefully constructed facade. He was simply too weary to pretend any longer. His mother had died of a sudden virulent illness when he was 7. He had been told, as children are told such things, that it was unexpected, a cruel twist of fate. He had not understood the true chilling implication until he was 18, and reading the same household records she had found, discovering the grim repeating pattern. Every woman who had held the title had left it, or left life itself, before 5 years were out. The Veldmoor men lived, burdened by their legacy, and the Veldmoor women did not, succumbing to an unseen force. His father had remarried when Crispin was 12. He remembered the woman vividly, a widow from Lincolnshire, composed and practical, with no apparent susceptibility to what she had been told were the exaggerations of local gossip, the fanciful tales of a cursed house. She had lasted 9 months. She had left in February, fleeing in the dead of winter without even stopping to pack her belongings, which was the detail Crispin had always found most telling, most chilling. A woman who did not stop to pack was a woman who had decided that what she was leaving behind was worth infinitely less than the time it would take to collect her things. She was running from something truly terrifying. She had said in her brief, frantic letter that she heard something at night, something that tapped, something that whispered. She said it was not possible, that her reason was intact, but that she would not return, for the terror of it was too great. His father had given up after that, a broken man, which Crispin understood and did not judge. He himself had never intended to marry, had told Drummond as much, determined to break the pattern by ending the line. And then his father's solicitor had come to him in September with the account of a £400 debt, and a woman in Norwich who stood to lose everything she had, a woman of quiet strength and formidable skill. And some part of him, the part that Crispin kept less carefully controlled than the rest, a flicker of intuition he rarely acknowledged, had made a decision he could not entirely explain even now. "You thought," Perdita said, her voice soft, "that if you brought someone here who was a seamstress, someone who could understand what Maren left behind and perhaps complete it." "I did not think it through that clearly," he interrupted, his voice rough with honesty. "My reasoning was not so precise. I thought that you were someone who worked with your hands, who understood things made rather than merely inherited, who saw the world through the lens of creation and completion, and that perhaps—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I did not have a rational plan. I had a feeling, a deep, persistent intuition, that the situation required someone specific, someone with a particular kind of understanding, and that you might be that person. It was not well reasoned, I admit." "No," she agreed, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "But it may not be wrong. Intuition often guides where logic falters." She looked at the fire for a moment, its flames reflecting in her storm-grey eyes. "What happened to the scar on your hand, Crispin?" He looked down at the back of his left hand, his gaze tracing the silver line that stood out starkly against his skin. "When I was 23, I had decided, in my youthful arrogance, to enter the wing myself and see what was there, to confront the mystery. I went to the door in the dead of night and I got the first 2 locks open. The third one I could not find the key for. My father had kept it separately, hidden away, and I did not know where. So I attempted to force the door to break it down with sheer will." A pause, his voice dropping. "The door did not yield. What I have there is what it left me with when it did not. A reminder of its resistance." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "The door resisted you, it fought back." "The lock resisted me. There is a difference, a significant one, I believe." "Is there?" Her tone held a subtle challenge, a quiet insistence on deeper meaning. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw in his face not the careful management, not the guarded distance, but the raw, vulnerable thing that lived behind it. A man who had been carrying the immense weight of his own house, its history and its sorrows, for most of his life. A man who had not, in all that time, had anyone sit across from him in a library by a dying fire and say what she was about to say. "I have the third key," she said, her voice quiet but firm. A statement of absolute certainty. He went absolutely still, his storm-grey eyes widening fractionally, his breath held. "It is not a key for a lock in the physical sense," she clarified, anticipating his confusion. "I mean I have the thing required to open that room, to complete what remains. I am a seamstress. I can finish what Maren started. I think that is what the house has been waiting for all these long years." She watched his face, carefully observing his reaction. "The sound comes every night. It has been coming for 40 years. It has been waiting for someone who could answer it, who could understand its plea." He was silent for so long that the fire settled twice, its embers glowing softly, and she watched 3 full minutes pass by, the ornate clock on the mantelpiece, its steady, ticking the only sound in the room. "I have spent 19 years, he said, his voice a low, haunted whisper, "ensuring that no woman in this house would be harmed by what is in that room. I have dedicated myself to that protection." "And you have managed that," she countered gently, "by sealing the room and ignoring the sound and keeping every countess at such a careful distance that none of them could discover what the house truly needed. You have protected them from the symptom, but not addressed the cause." His jaw tightened, a muscle clenching. "It was not without cost. To myself, to the women who fled. I know that." She leaned forward slightly, her voice imbued with a quiet conviction. "Crispin, what is in that room is not waiting to cause harm. I do not believe that is what this is. A woman died with unfinished work, a promise broken by fate, and she has been asking for 40 years for someone to complete it to bring her peace. That is not a curse of malice. That is grief with nowhere to go, a soul bound by an unfulfilled task." He looked at her with the winter sky eyes, and she saw him working through something profound, something that he had arranged into one rigid shape long ago, a truth he had accepted. And now, she had just asked him to look at it from an entirely different direction, to dismantle a lifetime of belief. "You cannot enter that wing," he said, his voice firm, a last desperate attempt to hold on to his conviction. "I need the third key," she said, her gaze steady, unwavering. "The key of understanding, of skill, of completion." She entered the north wing at 11 o'clock on the following night. The decision had solidified within her not as a conscious choice, but as an understanding that formed during the quiet hours between their conversation in the library and the first faint sound of the needle at 10:30. When the tapping began, she was already dressed, already holding the candle holder, already standing at her bedroom door, a quiet resolve settling in her heart. The house was calling, and she would answer. She had made her way to the gallery and then to the north corridor, the silence of the house pressing in around her. The 3 locks she found there were not the insurmountable obstacle she had expected, the 2 older locks she had studied in the days prior, their mechanisms ancient but discernible. She had watched Price with his household keys, noting the specific shapes and sizes, and she had observed Mrs. Nuttall, the housekeeper, with her own ring. And she had found in the second drawer of the east cabinet in the library a small unassuming tin box that was not catalogued in any of the household records she had read. Inside the tin box were 2 keys, both iron, both old, their metal worn smooth with age, and a third, smaller, brighter key, clearly newer than the rest, its brass gleaming faintly. She had taken all 3 the previous afternoon, held them in her palm and looked at the locks on the north wing door, doing the work of fitting them in her mind. She had been fitting things to their purpose since she was 8 years old, an innate skill honed over years of precise work. It was not a different skill, merely a different application. The first lock, the mechanism turned with a soft click. The second, another quiet thud. The third. The brass key slid in smoothly, and a final resonant thud echoed in the silent corridor. The heavy door swung inward without resistance, as if it had been waiting for her, for this precise moment. The air that came out was cold, not merely the cold of a room unused in winter, but the profound, pervasive cold of something held in suspension, the particular, almost palpable chill of a space where time had been moving differently than the time outside it, where moments stretched and lingered. She stood in the doorway and let the cold settle around her shoulders, a silent embrace, and she held her candle up, its flame flickering in the unusual air. The north workroom. It was not destroyed. It was not even dusty in the way she had expected. There was dust, certainly, the fine, soft dust of 40 years, settled in the places that were never disturbed, on the shelf edges and the sill of the narrow window. But the room itself was in a state of arrested occupation, a tableau frozen in time, a chair pushed back from a work table, as though its occupant had just stood up for a moment, intending to return, a thread drawer open, with spools of silk and cotton arranged by weight and color, precisely in the way Perdita herself arranged them. Scissors lay on the table beside a marked length of lining, their blades gleaming faintly. And in the center of the room, on a dressmaker's stand that had clearly been built for someone smaller than herself, stood a gown, ivory silk, figured with a small repeated pattern of white on white that she could only discern when she brought the candle close. A delicate vine, she realized, the same ivy pattern that adorned the wallpaper in the entrance hall, worked intricately into the silk by someone who had known this house intimately and wanted her dress to be of it, to embody its spirit. The gown was perhaps half assembled. The bodice was complete, its seams perfectly executed, and the skirt was cut and basted, the large temporary stitches that held pieces together before the real permanent work began. The hem was not turned. The sleeves were laid out flat on the table beside the stand, pinned at their seams but not yet joined, waiting for their completion. 40 years of work that needed doing, 40 years of patient, silent waiting. The needle sound stopped. The rhythmic tapping which had guided her here ceased entirely. In the sudden, profound silence, Perdita felt the cold shift, not intensify but move, a subtle displacement of air, the way a room shifts when a second person has entered it, a presence acknowledged. She turned her head slightly as though looking at something from the edge of her vision rather than directly at it, a cautious respect for the unseen. The candle flame went briefly blue. Just for a moment, a fleeting, ethereal flicker, just long enough to register, to confirm. Then it returned to amber, its steady glow unwavering, and the cold settled, a quiet, lingering presence. Perdita looked at the unfinished dress, its ivory silk shimmering in the candlelight, and understood, with a certainty that resonated deep within her, that she was not alone in the room, and that the presence that shared it with her was not afraid. It was expectant. She set the candle down on the work table, its light spreading softly over the tools. She examined the gown the way she examined every commission, by touch and by eye, her skilled fingers tracing the seams, working from the completed sections outward to the unfinished ones, understanding the structure from the inside out. The silk was extraordinarily fine, its weave exquisite. 40 years had not dimmed its luster. It held its ivory color without yellowing, a condition that ought not to have been possible, and which she chose not to think about directly, simply accepting it as another facet of the room's unique reality. The bodice seams were finished in a style she recognized as 1820s technique. She had learned it from her father, who had learned it from his teacher, a silent chain of hand that reached back through generations of the profession. The stitches were small and even, entirely competent, a testament to Maren's skill. She found the thread in the open drawer, a spool of ivory silk that matched the gown perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. She sat down in the chair that was already pushed back from the table, already at the right height for someone of her proportions, as though Maren herself had just risen from it. She threaded the needle she found beside the scissors, its eye glinting in the candlelight, and with a quiet, resolute breath she began. The task was clear. She worked through the night. She did not know how long it took, lost in the rhythm of her hands. The cold remained in the room, a constant companion, and she worked inside it without discomfort, which she noted and set aside. Another peculiarity of the north wing. The silk fed through her hands with the ease of material that had been waiting to be worked, that had maintained its preparation across 4 decades with some quiet confidence that the work would resume. She spoke aloud once, her voice a soft murmur, not to the room in general but to the air immediately around her, a brief acknowledgement, the kind that one craftsperson offers another when working on someone else's commission, a silent understanding. She said, "I understand what you started. I will finish it honestly with all the care it deserves." The cold shifted again, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, as if a quiet sigh had passed through the room. She thought it might have been an answer, a gentle acceptance. She was joining the second sleeve, her fingers moving with practiced precision when the door opened behind her. She did not stop working. Her needle continued its rhythmic dance, her focus unwavering, the delicate silk flowing through her fingers. The seam was at a critical point, demanding her full attention. Crispin stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. She could hear his breathing, controlled the deep, measured breaths of a man who had reached the top of a flight of stairs at speed and had paused, perhaps, to compose himself before entering a room charged with such potent stillness. She heard him take in what he was seeing, the lit workroom, a beacon in the silent wing, her at the table, bent over the intricate task. The gown on the stand, visibly further along, its ivory silk now graced with a completed sleeve, a testament to hours of quiet labor, a progress that had been absent for 40 years. Perdita. His voice was low and carefully even, and she recognized this as the version of his voice he used when he was most unsettled, when his carefully constructed composure was most strained, because the very effort of the evenness was audible, a fragile shield. "The seam is at a critical point," she said, her voice calm, not looking up. "Give me 30 seconds. He was quiet. She heard him step into the room, his footsteps soft on the stone flags, the subtle shift of air as he moved closer. She finished the seam, her final stitches small and precise, then turned the sleeve, pressing the join flat with the heel of her hand in the way her father had taught her, a gesture of practiced completion before setting the whole aside. Then, and only then, did she turn to face him. He was standing 2 feet from the doorway, his gaze fixed on the gown on the stand. His expression was the expression she had seen in the library when she told him she had the third key. Not the managed face, not the carefully constructed mask, but the raw, vulnerable face underneath it. Raw and entirely undefended, stripped bare of all pretense. "You took the keys from the cabinet," he said, his voice a low, flat statement. "Yes. You did not tell me. They would have tried to stop me," she stated simply, without apology. He looked at her then, away from the dress, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, resigned. "I would have. I would have felt it my duty." "The dress needed finishing," she said, her voice imbued with a quiet conviction. "It has needed finishing for 40 years. You could not do it, and no one else in this house could do it, and I am here and I can. It seems straightforward, a task requiring completion." "It is not straightforward." But his voice as he said it had lost its edge, the underlying tension dissipating. He was looking at the dress again, his gaze lingering on the ivory silk, the delicate ivy pattern, the now completed sleeves. "My mother came into this wing," he said, his voice a haunted whisper, "when she was ill, near the end. She was found in this room, clutching a piece of the silk." "I know," Perdita said quietly, her heart aching for the lost woman. She could not have sewn it. She was not trained. She had no skill for it. No. The woman before her, the one who left in February without packing, the one who fled in terror. He stopped, the memory clearly painful. "She heard the sound and came to the door," Perdita said, completing his thought, her voice gentle but firm, "and the door answered her with cold and darkness, and she did not have the means to understand what was being asked of her, what the sound truly signified. So she ran. Anyone without the specific knowledge to complete this work, without the understanding of a seamstress, would experience this room as a place that wanted something from them that they could not give, a demand they could not fulfill." She paused, letting the truth settle. "I have the knowledge. I can give what was asked. I can complete the task that binds her here." He was watching her in a way that had nothing to do with the careful management of the previous weeks, nothing to do with polite society. He was watching her the way she watched a length of cloth before she cut, closely, completely, trying to understand it along the grain, to discern its true nature. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low, a genuine question. She considered the question honestly, turning it over in her mind. "No," she said, her gaze steady. I think I would be if I did not understand what this was, if I believed it to be malice, but I do understand it, and the room is cold, not hostile. There is a difference, a profound one. It is a place of grief, not malevolence. He looked at the gown, a long silence stretching between them, filled only by the quiet settling of the old house. She was a seamstress, he said, his voice a revelation, as if he were only just discovering the full weight of the fact. Before the marriage, just like you. I know. She must have... He stopped again, searching for words, for understanding. He seemed to be working something through that he had not let himself work through before, a truth he had consciously avoided. She must have understood that the dress was not finished, and she died knowing it, knowing her work was undone. She did, Perdita said softly, and she has been asking for 40 years for someone to finish it honestly, not out of obligation, not because a debt required it, but because they understood what the work meant to her, the quiet dignity of creation, because they could grant her that peace. He turned from the dress to look at her directly, his storm-grey eyes holding a depth of emotion she had never seen before. She held the look, and neither of them said anything for a moment, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "The sound has stopped," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She had not noticed, so engrossed had she been in their conversation. She noticed now the room was quiet, utterly still, and the cold had shifted during their conversation to something that was less a tangible presence than a quality of the air, the comfortable, natural cool of an old stone house at night, rather than anything more particular, more oppressive. "Not yet entirely," she clarified gently. "The sleeves are joined, but the hem is not turned and the lining is not set. 2 more hours of work, perhaps 3. Then it will truly be at rest." He looked at the work table, at the spools of thread and the scissors and the pinned lining, the tools of her trade. "May I help?" he said. And it was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but something that occupied the honest, vulnerable space between them that she had come to understand as his particular register when he meant something completely, when his guard was truly down. "Have you sewn before, Crispin?" she asked, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," he admitted, a hint of wry humor in his voice. "You can press seams," she said, her eyes twinkling, "and hold pins, and tell me if the hemline is even when I cannot see it from this angle, when I'm too close to the fabric." He took off his coat, its dark wool heavy in his hands, and draped it over the back of the second chair, a silent acceptance of the task. He sat down across the work table from her, his posture still, attentive. They worked through the remaining hours without unnecessary speech, a shared, quiet purpose binding them. She found that he took instruction precisely and without argument, that he held pins at exactly the angle she indicated, his fingers surprisingly steady, and pressed a seam with the consistent measured pressure that the work required once she had shown him how. Once, when she was working the hem along the back panel and needed to see the fall of the skirt from a distance, she asked him to hold the light. He came around behind her, his presence a warm anchor, and held it at exactly the right height without being told, adjusting it subtly when she moved to a better angle, entirely focused on what the work needed, on their shared task. Near what she estimated to be 4 in the morning, the first faint hint of dawn just beginning to touch the horizon, she set the final stitch. She tied it off, a small, secure knot. She cut the thread, the snip of the scissors sharp in the quiet room. She held the scissors down to the table, her hands finally still. The cold left the room in the way that a long-held breath finally releases, not abruptly, but as though what had been sustained for a long time was finally ready to stop, to dissipate. The temperature evened, becoming simply the natural coolness of the house. The quality of the air changed, losing its heavy, expectant stillness, and the gown on the stand, in the soft candlelight, was finished. Truly, beautifully finished. Ivory silk, ivy pattern, white on white, the length of it perfect and complete. The work of 2 women separated by 40 years, yet bound by the same specific knowledge of what cloth required, of what a soul desired. Perdita sat back in her chair, a profound sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her, and looked at it, the finished gown shimmering softly. "Is it done?" Crispin said, his voice hushed, almost reverent. He was still standing beside her, the light still in his hand, his gaze fixed on the dress. "Yes," she said, her voice a quiet certainty. "It is done. Marin's work is complete." He set the light down on the table, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at the gown for a long moment, then he looked at her, and his expression was the face underneath the face, entirely open, entirely vulnerable, the managed version completely set aside. What was visible beneath it was a man who had carried the immense weight of this house for 19 years, a burden of sorrow and unanswered questions, and had just felt a significant portion of it lift, leaving him lighter, freer than he had ever been. "I did not know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I sent for you that it would be this, that you would bring such peace. I know you did not. I would not have sent for you if I had known. I would not have put you in reach of it, of this burden. I know that too." She met his eyes, the storm-grey eyes that had been giving nothing away for 32 years, holding secrets and sorrows, and were giving something away now, a profound gratitude, a dawning hope. "It would have been the wrong decision. You understand that now." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words, the truth of them. "The arrangement," he said, his voice careful yet entirely without its former formal distance. "The year. If you wish to leave now, you have more than fulfilled whatever obligation." "I am aware of the terms," she interrupted gently. "I negotiated them, you may recall." She looked at the finished gown, its presence a quiet testament to their shared night. "The arrangement was made under incomplete information on both sides. I think we are entitled to renegotiate, to build something new based on complete understanding." His voice was careful and direct, and entirely without the formal distance that had once defined him. "What terms would you propose, Miss Wren?" She looked at him with the same steadiness she had used on the very first evening, when he had told her she could leave at the end of 1 year, and she had told him she kept the agreements she made. "A real marriage," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not a legal arrangement, not a year with an escape clause, a conditional bond, a marriage made by two people who have chosen each other, who have seen each other, which is the only kind worth having, the only kind that can truly stand." He looked at her for a long time, his storm-grey eyes searching hers, seeking the truth in her words. The gown was finished behind her, a silent witness. The north wing was quiet around them, its long-held grief finally at rest. The cold was entirely gone, replaced by a gentle warmth. "I have not made it easy," he said, a note of self-reproach in his voice. "No," she agreed, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You have not. But easy is rarely worthwhile. I have spent 3 weeks keeping you at careful distance, erecting barriers. You have also prepared a workroom for me before I arrived, a space of understanding, and told me where to find the household diary, guiding me to the truth, and sat with me in the library for an hour saying nothing. When nothing was precisely what the situation required, your presence a quiet comfort. You are not a simple man to understand, Crispin Veldmoor, but you are not an impossible one." Something that was not managed and not careful and not controlled moved across his face, a profound relief, a dawning tenderness. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers strong and warm around hers, the silver scar on the back of his own hand catching the candlelight, a reminder of past struggles now softened by new hope. "Then let me be plain," he said, his voice low and firm, "in case you have any remaining uncertainty on the point. I did not bring you here because of the debt. I brought you here because I had read your father's account books and his client correspondence, which Drummond provided as context for the debt, and I had concluded that his daughter was the most competent and determined person he had encountered in 20 years of business, a woman of remarkable strength and insight. And I could not justify it better than this. I wanted to know her, to understand what made her so." A pause, his gaze intense. "I did not expect to find that I was right, that you would be even more than I had dared to hope." Perdita was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words, their raw, unexpected honesty. "You read my father's correspondence," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. Yes, that is a great deal of trouble to go to for someone you intended to keep at a careful distance, Lord Veldmoor. In retrospect, he said, a faint, self-deprecating smile touching his lips, the strategy was not coherent. It was deeply flawed. She turned her hand in his so that they were palm to palm, his fingers curving gently around hers, a silent connection. No, she said, her voice soft. But I find I prefer it to a coherent one. It led us here. Outside the narrow window of the north wing workroom, the first delicate grey of early morning was beginning to separate the darkness from the horizon, painting the sky with subtle hues. The candles had burned down to their last half-inch, their flames flickering softly. The gown on the stand held its ivory color in the growing light, a symbol of completion and peace. She had finished what had been asked of her. She had made, in the making of it, a different kind of choice. A choice for a future she had never anticipated. Crispin Veldmoor stood in the room his house had kept sealed for 40 years, in the half-light of a morning that had not yet decided to be autumn or winter, holding the hand of the seamstress who had just completed what no one had been able to do, and he did not look like a man who was keeping anything at careful distance. He looked like a man who had run out of reasons to. "Marry me," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "Not from a legal arrangement, not from a debt, but because you are who you are, Perdita Wren, and I would very much like to know what the next 40 years are like with you in this house, with you by my side." She considered him seriously for a moment, as she considered everything, completely and without sentiment obscuring the view, her practical intelligence assessing the profound depth of his offer. "Yes," she said, a quiet certainty in her voice, "on the condition that the workroom is mine, permanently mine." "It was always going to be yours," he said, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. "It was always meant for you." "Good," she said, her smile mirroring his. "Then we are agreed, Lord Veldmoor." The morning came through the window, gentle and clear, washing the room in soft light, and the north wing of Veldmoor Hall, which had been cold and sealed and full of unfinished things for 40 years, was warm. Its long sorrow had finally found its peace.